Good evening and welcome to Chasing the Facts. I'm Sam Chase, your host, and today is October 12th, 2022, and with us this evening is Mr. Rodney Elliott, who is a candidate for state representative in the 16th Middlesex District. Now, as viewers probably remember, we've just gone through a redistricting. So, and the district that you are running for, obviously, is one of the redistricted ones, and boy, I'll tell you, if you look at the way these lines are drawn, it's pretty interesting. So you have, in Chelmsford, precincts 1, 2, 3A, 5B, and 6. So if you add the 3A and 5B, that's 1. So that's roughly the equivalent of 4 precincts. And then what do you have in Lowell?
Good evening, Sam. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Oh,
nice
you're welcome.
to see you again, and hello
Good
to
to see
everybody
you.
at home. The configuration of the district is rather unique, if you will. But to follow up on your question, in Lowell, there are two complete neighborhoods, I will say, and they're both on the north side of the river, which is Centerville, the entire district of Centerville, and the entire section of the Pawtuckaville neighborhood. So essentially from the Dracut to the Tingsboro line is the Lowell portion of the district. And then, as you mentioned, there are essentially four precincts, which I've learned very well over the course of the last 5 and going on 6 months, trying to get to every home, certainly been on every street, because it's important to know the district, certainly geographically speaking, but also the people and what's on their, on their minds, and telling them why I'm running. So it's, as you know, from certainly the Tingsboro line down Dunstable Road, you follow North Road all the way to Chelmsford Street and the Westlands. So it's
Well, you've lived in this area all your life,
right?
So you're already familiar with the area and Chelmsford and so forth. And just as an FYI to the viewers, we had originally talked about doing sort of a debate format, which I usually don't do on this show. And Rodney's opponent is Carla Miller. And I just want the viewers to know that we did reach out to her, but we have not heard back from her. And we're getting very close to the election now. Time is of the essence. And Rodney was interested in coming on the show, and I felt that we owed him that chance to talk to the voters, which is always something that's, I think, a good thing, for you to get your message out. So any candidate between now and election who wants to appear on the show, please contact me. It's clochase@verizon.net, and we'll schedule something for you. Okay, so we'll do that. So
and thank you, Sam. Thank you. I do appreciate it. I think it's important. Local cable, people can watch it in their homes to hear, who we are and why we're running, and how can we address the issues certainly of the concern to voters and residents and taxpayers. How can we help on how does that interface with the state level and the resources that I plan to bring to this district, and work in concert, because as Chelmsford does have three individuals representing certain sections, and I do think it's important moving forward that, and if I've heard something that Chelmsford folks would like to have their own representative, and I agree. Redistricting was just completed, but that being said,
we're 25% better, I guess, than we were before.
Yes, right.
We had 4, so now we're down to 3.
Right, but I think it will be important, and I think I mentioned this on your show the last times, and I won't be too repetitive, but it's in Lowell, we up to the last election, we all ran at large, so we pay attention, and it's important to pay attention to every neighborhood in the city, because we all run at large, and I thought that was one of the the beauties of the system, but there were some drawbacks too. So Chelmsford, if I'm elected, they're going to have a strong voice, certainly in North Chelmsford, but also to work in concert with the other 2 representatives.
And I think you have actually, with the reduction in the number of people that will be representing Chelmsford, I think you have a better opportunity to work with that particular, I like to call it a delegation, because we have 3, and I think that's an appropriate thing. And where you will have the equivalent, if you're elected, you'll have the equivalent of 4 precincts. And the person who will represent the 14th Middlesex actually will have 5 precincts in Chelmsford, which is quite a number, okay? So, you know, because we have been reduced from 4 to 3, we will have, I think, a stronger voice, because there will be more emphasis by the folks that do represent us. You're going to be forced to pay attention to Chelmsford issues. You are, okay?
Right.
So you should not be, in my opinion, considered the Lowell rep who happens to have Chelmsford tag along, because I don't think that's the
I
case.
appreciate that, because that is very true, and I've heard loud and clear, certainly on local issues with, you know, whether it's, you know, certainly Ledge Road and the dust and the quality of life of the issues that, you know, and what can we do at the state level? I hope to bring together some state agencies to address some of those issues, whether it's air quality, whether it's, you know, capacity on some of those roads that we had very similar. And just for the residents that may not know, I was on the city council in Lowell and served the term as mayor for 24 years. So, you know, periodically, very similar issues, or somewhat similar issues in Chelmsford, we'd have to deal with, whether it was, you know, certainly rail cars or large vehicles on the wrong roads, big trucks getting stuck, you know, under the bridges. So, to me, I believe there's always a solution to the problem, and I spent a fair amount of time out in that particular area and on Swain Road, and just the number of trucks.
Traffic is a huge issue, especially
huge issue.
in that upper portion of the district that you.
But just getting back to the, you know, the not just being Lowell centric, you know, PFAS. There is, if elected, and you know, on day one. I think the economic development bond bill is one of the priorities. Number one, it includes the $500 million that going back to taxpayers as a result of Chapter 62. The excess revenue that's going back to the taxpayers as a result of the state law, and I think that law should stay in place. I know I maybe see some articles here and there that should be eliminated. I don't believe so. It was voted by the people in 1986. It should remain state law, any ballot question. So, and that goes with, you know, along with some of the other ballot questions that we can talk about. But, you know, whether it's PFAS, or I can just say from an infrastructure perspective from the town as a whole, including Lowell, we have some, you know, combined sewer overflows. There are capacity issues here in Chelmsford, which does prohibit economic development. But, you know, I have some ideas. I have a couple of very good ideas, speaking to wastewater treatment plant operators in the area, and how can we put a plan in place to expand capacity short of a wastewater treatment plant. And I think it's viable. I'd love to work with Department of Environmental Protection and the state, certainly to get funding for capacity, and how can you expand capacity. So, but I do know, and I've heard loud and clear, that that's important for economic development in Chelmsford. So, good example of the three representatives that will represent this area to go down as a coalition, if you will, and you know, beat the drum for money.
Well, that certainly is the hope, and you know, it's interesting you talk about the sewer, and I wish I knew, and I should probably know more about the way the sewer funding mechanisms work outside of the local level. So let me ask you a question: is there a degree of responsibility that the state and/or federal government have to support the regional sewer effort? I mean, it seems to me that I can remember years ago, the town was under a mandate to sewer. So the state is very famous for issuing mandates, but when you go looking for the dollars, well, you're going to have to reach into your own back pocket for that one. Okay.
I think that's a you've hit the nail right on the head.
No, and that to me is a problem. But
I mean, in Lowell, I can share with, and
that's where we are with the sewer, really, isn't it?
That's where we are. I think it's, you know, there are two issues that you know, that run concurrent. One is in Lowell, we are under consent decree, and we have been for at least 2 decades to separate our sewers, similar to across the country. But it hits the Northeast a little bit more.
Would that be stormwater versus sewage? Is that
well,
what you're talking about?
that brings up a good,
okay,
yeah,
sorry.
it is.
Go
it's
ahead.
separating the, you'll see the catch basins, when it rains, all the water goes into
Yes.
the catch basins. But in Lowell, because the system is so old, those lines were tied into the sewer,
right.
which now all these interceptors run to the wastewater treatment plant. And when you get 2 or 3 inches of water, the capacity at the, you know, it overwhelms the plant. So we have to release gates It's called a NEPTES violation, pollution discharge, and we don't want that. But to speak to your point, a point well made, it is a requirement. It's under the Clean Air Act. I did work at the Environmental Protection Agency for 25 years, so I know a little bit about it. But it's a good thing. It is the magnitude of the problem is nationwide because it requires non-point source runoff in some of the other less suburban areas. And it requires federal dollars. And I know Congressman Trahan has been fighting tooth and nail down there, but I can tell you in Lowell there's perhaps going to revisit, because we have been separating, but the cost of separating these waters, wastewater, sewer and stormwater is enormous. And we can only go up so much in the rates, but the rates, but similar to Chelmsford, communities can't fund these things.
Right.
I mean, which could be a little bit of a segue, and this is just on one of the ballot questions. Look, I've been very conservative. I've been the fiscal watchdog in Lowell since my tenure.
You absolutely have that reputation.
And I think it's a good thing because I spend the taxpayers' money as I spend my money, and I think it's important to carry that to the state. But that being said, when it comes to public transportation, when it comes to fixing our roads and fixing our bridges, in Lowell, there are a number of canals that the city of Lowell had to pay for. And we did get some federal Tiger Grant funding. However, operation maintenance, the roads and bridges, that is something the state has got to help both North Chelmsford, and Lowell, because if I've heard a consistent message from taxpayers, if I pay my taxes, why are my roads in such poor condition? And that leads me to the millionaire's tax. We don't want to scare any businesses out of the state, but again, if I heard from many residents and elected officials here in Chelmsford and Lowell, education is something that the property taxes pay for, and it's a staggering amount, and we try to balance police, fire, DPW, you name it. There's only so much, in my opinion, that that can be placed on the property tax owner. And
well, in the town of, we talked about this just a little off camera on the show. Lowell is a completely different demographic than Chelmsford, and gets a lot of its budget funded through state aid and so forth. And in my opinion, and nobody would accuse me of being a progressive, but in my opinion, I think that's appropriate. I mean, I think I think there is a moral responsibility at some point to help out people who are not as economically advantaged as other people, okay? I'll just leave it at that without getting into a lot of the details. But in Chelmsford, our problem is a little bit different because almost 80% of the town budget is funded through the property tax. And not everybody in Chelmsford is rich.
Right.
I mean, that may be the perception that some people have, okay? But I can tell you, I'm an assessor in town, and I have to sign off on all of the hardship exemptions. And it is amazing how many people in this town live on what they live on, okay? And somehow are able to maintain a home, So we're not in the upper tier of wealthy communities, okay?
Right.
So there is a tremendous concern about the amount of property tax that people have to pay in this town. So I don't know what the answer is. I really don't. I mean, you get into the philosophy, is this the way because it's not a progressive tax, it's a very regressive type tax. Right. It does not consider your ability to pay. You might be an elderly person living in a house that's worth $800,000, and you may have Social Security as your income.
Right.
And yes, there are those cases in town.
Right.
And you have them in Lowell too, I know. So how do we?
You raised a very good
How do we
point.
address that problem?
Yeah, and you mentioned, it's a regressive tax, and that's why I think this millionaire's tax, a surcharge on.
I was hoping you were going to get into that. That was the lead-in.
It's essentially, and folks know it's a ballot question, so it's up to the voters, but it's a surcharge on those that are making $1 million a year or more. I can just presume, certainly not in Lowell, but there's nobody in Lowell making $1 million a year, and I'm going to presume that, and if they can, then this is America. I understand.
God love them.
But if we want
Right.
to provide real tax relief to our municipalities, and if we want to properly fund education, if we do want to improve our roads and our bridges and transportation, then municipalities can't do it, and the state has to do it. And that source of revenue can be from this. And it's called fair share, and I believe it. So if we want real property tax relief, that relieves this funding will relieve a great burden of education, which then can be given back to the taxpayers, or can be used for all, for other services that people expect and quite frankly they deserve for their property taxes. So, and I think people making that much money, there's all these, as I've read about it a little bit more, it's less than 0.06%. Tufts University did a pretty good study, and the notion by the opponents that there's these folks are leaving, they're leaving the state. Regrettably, they find another domicile. They're wealthy enough to find another domicile. They live in there for X amount of days, and they still keep their home just to avoid the tax. So, we're not naive enough to think that there's going to be this flight, that businesses are going to leave. I think Massachusetts is rich with the labor market, with education, with medical, with health. Sure, I know there's some, there's a discussion out there that some people are leaving Massachusetts. I think there's a variety of reasons.
But that'll always be the case.
It'll always be the case, right. And there's no evidence to suggest because, taxes are so high that there's this mass migration.
Well, I think if we were having this discussion 40 or 50 years ago, I think based on the numbers at that time, I might agree that from an income tax perspective, we are a high tax state, but I don't think that's the case anymore. I think if you look at a lot of course, there are some states with no income tax. Right. We have one right to the north of us, right? But there are many states that are populated states where the state income tax liability is a lot higher than it is in Massachusetts, and we don't have a progressive tax. It's a flat tax.
Right.
Okay, so if you make $500,000 a year, if that's your taxable income, you are taxed at the same rate as a person who has a taxable income of $50,000 a year. Okay, so, and some people think that's fine, and I'm not going to, because that's a philosophical point. I'm not going to argue with them about it. Okay,
right.
But the fact of the matter is, no matter how you slice it, if you are fortunate enough to make a high income, you can afford to contribute a little bit more. I
think that's a good point. If we really want to help, and
right.
we do, and I do, working families, working class people who bear the burden of local services, they want their children educated, they want to be safe, they want police, and they want fire protection, then the strain on local budgets, as you very well know as a selectman, it's a balancing act, and this to me provides great relief to working class families, and it will inevitably help people making a lot less than $1 million a year.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think what we're voting for is an actual constitutional amendment. Correct. Is that correct? So,
yes.
So if that is adopted, then that becomes a matter of, well, it's part of the state constitution. So it'll be very, very difficult for politicians after the fact to go in and change the rules of the game.
Correct.
Okay, so
that's a very good point.
Yeah.
That's another sort of message out there that politicians are going to get in there. I can tell you just from my perspective, there's two specific purposes. There's two great needs, and I will not vote otherwise when it comes to that. But I think that's another point well taken. Yeah.
That's good, because I think if there is distrust, and I know there is because I've talked to people about this, about these kinds of initiatives, it's how many times in our lifetime have the politicians said, well, we're going to dedicate these funds to this, and then 5 years later, well, the lottery is a great example of that one, sure. Isn't it? Okay, so I mean, 5 years down the road, you say, wait a minute, you said you were going to fund exclusively this particular function, and we find now that the funds have been redirected someplace else. Well, you didn't tell us the truth. So right. why should we trust you going forward?
No, I think point well taken. Same thing with sports betting. I think it's a good thing. Millions going out to other states, and it's finally being adopted here in Massachusetts. I do think, and if I'm elected, I would file a bill that those revenues specifically would be dedicated to mental health service. There's there is a significant need across this Commonwealth in our schools for behavioral specialists, mental health specialists, and I think the magnitude cannot be lost. And if those funds, and again, let's dedicate certain those revenues. And a good example of something similar. So so voters don't think this is just a far-fetched idea. Cannabis. The sale of marijuana, Cannabis Control Commission allows municipalities, and Lowell adopted this, that a certain percentage of the revenue made from the sale of marijuana in Lowell specifically goes into a fund to improve municipal buildings. Certainly, a certain percentage goes to education and outreach, specifically related to marijuana use. But we thought it was important to designate that money so it's not going into the general fund. And so I think it's a poignant idea, a poignant thought that mental health crisis is, I think it's pervasive. I think I've heard it from most people that I've knocked on their doors, that we need to address it at whether it's substance abuse or mental health illnesses or so many other things.
Well, I've heard, and again, I don't know as much about the homeless issue as I should. I've learned a few things from being on City Life and having guests on there that work in that field and gotten some education. And it seems to me that a large part of the homeless issues that we're seeing, and yes, folks, in Chelmsford we do have homeless. It's not just Lowell. We have homeless in Chelmsford, okay? And mental health seems to be at the base of a lot of that.
100%.
So,
and it's complicated in each case.
how do we think? I don't know exactly, but,
Yeah,
but without addressing that issue, I think you're going to miss the boat on addressing the homeless issue. It's a combined approach that has to be taken. Am I that far off?
No, you're right on the money. There are some cases that are similar or assimilate, and then there are others. The spectrum of mental health. Or vis-a-vis, substance abuse it's complicated because there isn't one mold for every individual. There's a variety. Some, there are still some cases from the opioid crisis many years ago when young kids and people across the spectrum, everyone seemed to have someone that was affected by the opioid crisis, let's say 6, 7, maybe 10 years ago.
It's not limited to any particular socioeconomic strata either. It's across the board.
No, and that continues, and unfortunately there's always an element that gets into substance abuse, whether it started with high school drinking and leads to something else. And then there are individuals, whether it's family matters or other socio-economic issues that affect. So it is pervasive. I think COVID, when we were, everybody, it manifested itself during COVID, and everybody, lots, folks just became aware the magnitude of the issue. So I think it's going to take this multifaceted approach to, and it'll continue to be shelters, mental health inpatient facilities. It'll be outpatient. There's a facility just looking called VinFen, which I think it's a unique in Lowell. They provide, it's the constant treatment that will help us, survive and, get, come out of this mental health crisis. And it's going to take, so we talked about many different causes and the solutions, and the way to address that is also, also requires different treatment.
And I think we have if nothing else, we have a moral obligation to address that. Let me switch gears just for a little bit.
Yes.
I'm going to put on a conservative hat here a little bit, because you, with your time on the Lowell City Council, you have the reputation of being the fiscal watchdog or the financial guru, however you want to classify that. Anyway, I always read that in the newspapers and watched you on the City Council. So I'm going to assume that if you're elected, you're really going to pay attention to getting the best bang for the buck, okay, at the state level, and making sure that comes back to your constituency. Do you want to take a couple minutes and just talk about that?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I did focus. I was chair of the finance subcommittee for I was on the subcommittee 22 of the 24 years I was chair of that subcommittee. And, when I got on the council, The city was, we weren't in receivership, but we were under the Financial Control Board of, and I don't want to bore viewers, but I do feel that I played a role in some fiscal stewardship to make sure that we were delivering as much as we can. And where was there waste? Where could we improve? Where could we either regionalize or do a better job with our money? And at the same time, we wanted to do, in order to offset the burden of property taxes, because I do think it's a burden, how can we offset that? And that's by economic development. And that was certainly a team effort. So, and at the state level, I do hear, the state is flush. Why do we need this millionaire's tax? Well, most of the surplus, as I have learned and read, is as a result of capital gains. The stock market was doing very well.
Right.
Last fiscal year, the second largest piece was excise tax. People bought a lot of cars, they bought a lot of appliances. So I can assure the voters that is in my DNA. I think it's important to watch and ask questions, working with the auditor when reports come out, and hopefully I'll be put on some committees where I can do that job, because I do think there's always room for improvement with tax dollars.
So so I think maybe you might get some Republican votes there. Okay. No, I think it's fair to explore that, and of course, people who've watched my show understand that I'm always interested in the philosophical point of view, because if a person is very, very progressive, I think that's predictive of how they're going to act when they're in office, and the same is true on the other side. If they're very conservative, well, that's also predictive. But if you get elected, you're going to have to work with many different people in the legislature. Now, most of them call themselves Democrats, but we all know that those Democrats run the philosophical spectrum. You've got some very conservative Democrats in there, and you've got some that are way on the other side. Sure. So that's the
I think
area that you're going to have to work.
You're right. You've served on the member board of
yes.
selectmen. I've been on more 8-to-1 votes of 9 city councilors in Lowell, and you stand for them and you want to do what's right. Yep. And I think Lowell is in a much is in a very positive position financially, and that's the strength, because when you have to borrow, when you have to, that saves literally hundreds of thousands. Yep. So that will be good. I will not change, and I do think there's opportunity, because we know that there are areas, in state government and many others areas of government where we can do better. That's good.
Rodney, we've got a little less than 2 minutes, so I want to give you free rein here. You talk to the voters, and let's have your final message. And as Dennis Reddy used to say, ask for the vote.
Ask for the vote. I will. Thank you. My name's Rodney Elliott. Again, running for the 16th district, which includes parts of Lowell and North Chelmsford. Thank you to those who have greeted me at all the doors that I've knocked on. It has been a pleasure meeting so many new folks in Chelmsford. I'm going to go on Beacon Hill to represent this district, and I think one of the most important aspects is to bring money back to the district. People going to Boston, there's reps all over the place, representatives, and I have learned the issues. I understand the issues. I've served in, as a professional for 42 years in state, local, and federal government. I understand how government works. I also understand, as a city councilor, local needs and the help that we need from Beacon Hill, and I think that's the most important. And then secondly, constituent services. That was perhaps equally one of the most important aspects of being a city council. So I respectfully ask for your vote on November 8th. I will represent Chelmsford well. I will be your voice. I'm passionate about being an elected official and bringing those dollars and making Chelmsford and Lowell a better place for all of us to live.
That's good, and should you be elected, I think we will look forward to seeing you frequently in the town, in the district, at various events, and I know the Select Board is very interested in having the state reps in on at least a semi-annual basis for updates and so forth. So should you be successful, we look forward to seeing you in those venues as well. So Rodney, thank you very much for being on the show.